can join on in. And we're happy to have you all here with us today. This is a really exciting opportunity. We are broadcasting here from the Environmental Defense Fund offices in Raleigh, which is a real privilege and honor. And I'm looking forward to having you get to know some of the folks as we move forward into our next week of activities that I'll be giving more details moving forward. So I'm going to go ahead and start. I am Susanna Tuttle, the Director of North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light, and we are an organization working with faith-based congregations across the entire state of North Carolina to address the causes, consequences, and impacts of climate change as a moral imperative. We have educational programs that we can give direct services, including our energy audit and energy savings analysis program, help with creative financing options for solar with congregations, and then we also have a wonderful program that helps make the food faith climate connection, as well as working with partners like Audubon, North Carolina Wildlife Federation on habitat conservation and protection. So there's lots that we can share about that in future webinars, and I do hope that you'll visit our website at www.ncipl.org to learn about what kinds of programs and resources we can provide for you and your communities across the state. This session today is titled North Carolina Faith Voices for Clean Energy, Advocating with Compassion, a How-To Guide to the North Carolina General Assembly. And as I mentioned, we're so pleased to have the opportunity to present this webinar today in partnership with the Environmental Defense Fund. This program has been developed as part of NCIPL's Spring into Action campaign, along with 3 exciting events that we'll be hosting next week with IPL's founder, Reverend Sally Bingham, and there'll be more information and details about those events, as I mentioned, towards the end of this presentation. So today, our journey will answer 3 questions. How does the North Carolina General Assembly work? Who holds the power? What does it mean to advocate with compassion? And how can you put your faith into action? As a citizen, you have a unique opportunity to help make a difference by becoming more involved in communicating with your elected officials. We have 2 policy experts on the program today, and I'd like to begin by introducing NCIPL's advocacy consultant. Veronica Shingleton has over 15 years of public policy and advocacy experience on the state and federal level. Prior to starting her consulting firm, Harmonizing Strategies, she served as a policy advisor on energy and environment to former Governor Bev Perdue. She worked at the North Carolina Conservation Network for over 5 years as a climate and energy campaign coordinator. Veronica began her career at the North Carolina Coalition Against Sexual Assault as an education coordinator, developing public policy initiatives and training advocates to lobby. She is the former president of North Carolina Women's United, a Leadership Triangle Goodman Fellow, and has been appointed by the governor to serve on the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences Advisory Commission. She is a native of Western North Carolina and a graduate of Elon University. So I'd like to hand the presentation over to you, Veronica, and I'll see the rest of you in a little while. Thanks.
Thank you, Susanna. And for this portion of the presentation, I'm primarily going to be using
slides. I can't hear you, Veronica.
Oh. Can you hear me now? Susanna, can you hear me? Okay, it sounds like people can hear me fine. Okay, so Susanna, I'm not sure what's going on your end, but people are, okay, good. All right, I'm going to get going then. So, well, thank you all for joining us today. We are very excited about next week's Advocacy Day, the first ever Faith Voices for Clean Energy. And today I hope that you get a few tips to put in your toolbox, whether you're going to be joining us virtually or in Raleigh, or if you're going to meet with elected officials down the road. And just a reminder, we are going to have time for questions at the end of this, but you can go ahead and be submitting them as we go. So as a citizen of your city, county, and state, and country, there are a lot of elected officials who represent you in different types of elected office. Each state in the nation has a different government structure and cycle. But they all have the same three branches of government, which mirror the federal government: executive, judicial, and legislative branches. Today, our focus is going to be on the North Carolina legislative branch of government. The Republican Party currently holds the power in North Carolina because they control the legislative and executive branches of government. This includes the offices of governor and lieutenant governor, as well as the North Carolina General Assembly, which is commonly referred to as the legislature. And you will hear me probably interchange General Assembly and legislature throughout this presentation. They mean the same thing. In North Carolina, we have what is called a bicameral government. Just like Congress on the federal level, this means legislators are divided into two chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The legislature meets biennially, which means it meets for a total of 2 years. The purpose of the legislature is to create and change the laws of North Carolina, as well as to provide a budget for state government operations. Legislators are elected to 2-year terms, and elections are held every 2 years. All of the seats in the General Assembly were up for election this past fall, along with many local and federal elections. The Republican Party maintained enough seats in the legislature to have what is called a veto-proof supermajority. This means the Republicans control 3/5 of the voting members of the legislature and have the voting power to overturn any veto that the governor might issue. This supermajority has made the General Assembly more powerful than the governor himself. Now we're going to take a deeper dive into each of the chambers of the General Assembly. First, we're going to talk about the Senate. The president of the Senate is the Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina, but the Lieutenant Governor has very limited powers in the Senate and can only vote to break a tie. The President pro tem, Senator Phil Berger, holds the most power in the Senate, and some would argue in the entire state. With control over appointments of members to standing committees, he wields a heavy influence over bills. The Senate is generally considered the more powerful of the two chambers, even though it has fewer members. The House is led by a Speaker, who is Tim Moore. He holds powers similar to those of the Senate President pro tem, Senator Phil Berger. Each chamber, the Senate and the House, has its own set of committees and caucuses. A committee is a part of the legislative process. Each chamber has standing committees. Their membership and leadership can change year to year, but their roles remain essentially the same. Committee meetings are publicized and they're open to the public, and concerned citizens and interest groups are allowed to attend and give testimony. We're going to talk more about committees and their roles later in the presentation. A caucus is a group of people with similar beliefs. For example, each political party has its own caucus, and there are also ones based on shared interests like the sportsman or agricultural caucuses. These caucuses are used to hash out differences behind closed doors and to get a group to come to an agreement on bills. These meetings are not open to the public, and members are prohibited to discuss any details of these meetings. This is an overview of the legislature cycle, and as we discussed before, it lasts for a biennium, which is 2 years. The first part, or the regular session, is more commonly referred to as the long session and occurs in years ending in an odd number. For example, right now, 2015, we are in the long session, which began this past January. During the legislative session, meetings are held Monday nights and during the day on Tuesday, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. Most legislators return to their districts on the weekend to work and meet with constituents and spend time with their family. There's no limit on the length of any session, but typically the long session lasts for 6 months and the short session will last for about 6 weeks. Now we're going to take a closer look at the long session. The first part of the long session is the only time in the entire 2-year cycle when legislators can make a new law, repeal an existing law, or make changes to current law. Now, what I mean by this is that there's a very small window from January until about now, March or April, where legislators can introduce new bills which would make substantive changes to our laws. And these bills have to be filed and into the General Assembly before these bill filing deadlines are over, or they cannot be introduced throughout the rest of the session. So I'm stressing that because there is a frenzy going on right now in Raleigh trying to get bills introduced and in before these deadlines, which are quickly approaching, pass. So there are, of course, some ways to get around this. To get a bill introduced after the bill filing deadlines have passed and later during the session cycles, that must have an impact on the budget, or what's called a physical impact. Or it could be a recommendation by a legislative committee or commission, or it could be a PCS, which is an abbreviation for a preferred committee substitute. This is when a committee votes to strip the language out of an existing bill and replace it with completely new language. If you were following the coal ash bill last year, this is what happened to create the bill since they were in the middle of the legislative cycle. A bill can begin its journey in either chamber, the House or the Senate, and once a bill has been filed, it is then formally introduced to a chamber. For our purposes, let's say our bill was introduced into the Senate. It is then read into that chamber for the first reading and then referred to a committee. This is a formality and typically happens very quickly at the beginning of the day's session. Bills commonly move through more than one committee for approval. Sometimes this process can take months, and sometimes it can take only a few hours. A committee can choose not to take up or consider bills referred to them. If it is not considered or does not pass a vote of the committee, the bill is considered dead. If a bill does receive committee approval, it will return to the Senate floor for its second reading. If it passes the second reading, it will then have its third and final reading. After passing this third reading, the bill would be sent to the next chamber. So for our purposes, we started in the Senate chamber, so our bill would be sent to the House of Representatives. Once the bill passes out of its first chamber, either the House or the Senate, it has met a requirement called the crossover deadline. This is a date by which all bills that do not affect the budget or have what's called a physical impact must pass at least one of the two chambers in order to remain in consideration for the rest of the 2-year cycle. The crossover deadline only occurs during the long session. This year, the Senate has moved their crossover date up a week to April 30th, while the House crossover deadline is May the 7th. If a bill fails to meet this deadline, it is considered dead for the rest of the 2-year cycle. This is why the timing of advocacy and education efforts are so important during the first part of the long session, and it's even more important that advocacy and education efforts are happening leading up to sessions before they actually start. For our purposes, our bill has just passed the Senate and is being introduced into the House. So now the bill has to go through the same process it went through in the previous chamber: committees, votes, and readings. If a bill undergoes major changes and looks very different to what was approved by the first chamber, it has to be sent to a conference committee to be hashed out. The conference committee is made of a handful of members from both chambers and is charged with resolving the differences. Once a bill passes both houses and is signed by the governor, it is considered ratified. If the bill is a local law, it becomes law at that point. Otherwise, it becomes effective on a date outlined in the bill itself. After adjournment of the General Assembly, the governor has 30 days to act on a bill. If the governor vetoes a bill, the bill is returned to the General Assembly, where a vote of 3/5 of present and voting members can vote to override the veto. As you can see, the numerous deadlines from February to May of the long session are why you're seeing so many media reports and so many action alerts from advocacy groups right now. There's some critical deadlines that we're coming up against, and if we don't get good bills through before those deadlines and stop bad bills before those deadlines, then we've got another 2 years to wait until we have the opportunity to introduce good bills again. This also means that there's a small window of opportunity for you all to influence legislators and the outcome of legislation. This is why our Advocacy Day next week is so important, and meeting with elected officials in person is so vital to the work that we do. Because we have not gotten to the crossover deadlines yet, we still have time to build support and push through some bills that you'll hear Greg talk about shortly. So one last note on those bills which did make the crossover deadline I mentioned earlier. If they don't pass the General Assembly before they adjourn the long session in August, if they've met the crossover deadline, they're still considered alive and can be brought up during the short session. In between session, your legislator is home in the district working at their regular job. Being a legislator is only a part-time job and pays very little money. This is a great time to get to know your elected officials and educate them on your issues. If you're a member of a congregation that's been doing a lot of work with your green team, or if you've gone through an energy savings analysis, have installed solar, or anything like that, you have great stories to share. Elected officials are always looking for opportunities to get out into the community and see what's going on. During session, it's hard to get them there, but on the weekends, it's a great opportunity. And then when they adjourn between session, it's a great opportunity to invite them to come and see the work you all are doing. Finally, the last part of the General Assembly cycle is a short session. The short session is held in even-numbered years and typically lasts 6 weeks. During the short session, legislators work primarily on tweaking the budget and making any changes prior to the fiscal year, which starts on July 1st. They consider committee recommendations of bills, and they take up any bills that are alive because they met the crossover deadline but were not budget-related. Again, there's an even shorter amount of time during even-numbered years during the short session to influence your legislators and impact legislation during the session. This is why the work you all are doing on a regular basis throughout the year is so critical. And as important as it is to come to Raleigh and email your elected officials while they're in Raleigh, it's just as important to continue to do that work in your home communities. NCIPL is working to build support for good policies in North Carolina, which support increasing energy efficiency, clean renewable energy, and carbon mitigation. Today, we're excited to have with us Greg Andek, who's the North Carolina Senior Manager for Clean Energy with the Environmental Defense Fund. He's going to give us an overview of clean energy policies moving through the General Assembly. Greg leads strategy development and outreach to leading companies, regulators, and policymakers to advance the Environmental Defense Fund Clean Energy Program objectives. In the Southeast, his work accelerates the investment of clean energy and fosters a modern, intelligent, interactive electricity system designed to maximize renewables, efficiency, and reductions in air pollution. Greg also manages Environmental Defense Fund's efforts to advance innovative energy financing mechanisms in urban and rural areas that spur clean energy, create jobs, and save communities money by reducing utility bills. He serves on the board of NC Green Power, the first statewide renewable energy program in the country, and Envision Charlotte, which is an innovative public-private partnership working to significantly reduce energy use and air emissions in Charlotte. Greg, thank you so much for taking time to join us on this webinar. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Great. Thank you, Veronica, for the warm welcome.
We cannot hear you.
Really?
Can you hear us now? How is that? Can folks hear us now?
It looks like folks can hear you, so go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Veronica, for the warm introduction, and I can't say how excited EDF is to be partnering with Interfaith on this. You know, we've really benefited from having Reverend Sally Bingham on our national board and from having Susanna here in North Carolina and the guidance we've been getting from Veronica as we move forward on these really critical legislative issues. I also wanted to just mention that my colleague, Marilyn Marsh Robinson, is also here with us, that many of you may have interacted with in the past, who manages a lot of our rural outreach and engagement with faith communities, particularly in the eastern part of the state. So if you haven't had a chance to connect with her, she's really great on a lot of these issues. Now, just as a little bit of background, you know, EDF has been partnering with a number of organizations to help connect with conservative lawmakers, including businesses, rural voices, military voices, and now through this partnership, faith voices. And really, your ability to speak passionately about these issues from a faith perspective can break down silos and in a way help win the hearts and minds of our lawmakers on these important issues. And the reason why that's important is 2015 is turning out to be just an incredibly critical year in North Carolina for energy issues. And if you're like me, you know, it can be incredibly frustrating to hear about many of the things going on in North Carolina related to coal ash and offshore drilling and fracking, and easy to get down. But the fact is, one of the real bright spots and the opportunity ahead through our conversations with lawmakers is around clean energy. The fact is that conversations around fossil fuels can oftentimes be divisive, but polls regularly show that North Carolinians support clean energy by really wide margins on both sides of the spectrum, political spectrum. So we think that presents a really strong opportunity as you really leverage the faith community and think about how to present energy issues to lawmakers, that focusing on clean energy can be a really winning issue. Now, as some of you know, North Carolina has had a huge success in solar growth in the last few years. And in fact, North Carolina is the #1 state on the East Coast for total installed solar. And we just learned that North Carolina is #2 nationally in the total solar installations that occurred in 2014, just behind California. So incredible growth, really great, obviously, from an environmental perspective. Lots of jobs are being created, especially in some of our rural counties that have suffered economically for decades. And so that then, of course, begs the question, why has our solar industry in North Carolina grown so rapidly? And there's a couple reasons. You know, first is, of course, solar technology costs have declined really rapidly in recent years. Businesses have made some really critical technological and business model breakthroughs. But just as important are North Carolina's renewable energy policies. And there's two that I really want to highlight. The first is our renewable portfolio standard, and that requires our utilities to increase the amount of renewable energy and energy efficiency on their system to 12.5% by 2020. What that policy did several years ago was sent a signal to clean energy companies around the country that North Carolina was friendly to clean energy business. And so we saw a lot of early demand for clean energy happen in the state. That attracted lots of companies, that attracted lots of jobs. Unfortunately, that policy has been under attack in our legislature over the last few years by some misguided voices. And so we really want to make sure that that policy stays intact and is strengthened over time, not taken away. The second big policy is the Renewable Energy Investment Tax Credit. Now, that policy currently provides a 35% tax credit on clean energy project costs, which help make these projects more affordable to homeowners and businesses. That credit is due to expire at the end of the year, and so what we're really trying to do is extend that tax credit and make sure that we don't get into a dangerous cycle where we have a credit one year and we don't the next year, and that makes it really challenging for businesses and homeowners to plan ahead for what a clean energy future should look like. We want a much smoother transition away from subsidies over time rather than a start and stop mentality. And so continuing that tax credit and making sure that we do have a smooth transition is going to be really important. Policies like these stimulate the clean energy market, create jobs, and frankly, they're also really important to churches directly. Helps make it more affordable and easier to install solar panels directly on churches and other places of worship. And it also is policies for congregants that may be interested in sourcing more renewable energy at home. So those are two policies right now on the books, ground zero for protection. There's another policy that's really gaining some traction and momentum this year called third-party sales. Now, currently in North Carolina, only utilities like Duke Energy can sell customers electricity directly. And so in essence, they operate as a monopoly, and customers in North Carolina have very few energy options. On the other hand, states that allow third-party sales of electricity have a much wider range of clean energy providers that can sell them clean energy directly. And those companies oftentimes have innovative finance models that make it easier and more affordable for homeowners and businesses to put solar on their rooftops. So third-party sales is going to be a really important policy this year. Some of you may have seen that Representative Zoka introduced a bill earlier in the week to help advance third-party sales and provide more energy choice and competition in the marketplace. And that will be something that we think both conservative and progressive lawmakers really start to get behind. So those are really the three big clean energy policies that we think are going to be especially critical this year: the REPS, the Renewable Energy Investment Tax Credit, and third-party sales. And all of those are places where there's real potential to have a breakthrough with conservative lawmakers from a faith perspective. So I'll just end by thanking you all so much. This is just critically important work, and your faith voice is critical to ensuring that we move forward, not backwards. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Greg. It's a real honor to have the level of expertise be addressing our group here today, and I appreciate all of you on the webinar and hope to see that you can understand the partnerships that we are developing through NCIPL are really here to be for you, so that when we're asking questions, when we're trying to learn how to be involved in public policy advocacy, that we have the very best information available to us. So I know that Greg is available to be contacted through by you contacting us, and we can ask him any questions, and I hope you will continue to ask questions through the chat box today, because we are going to have a question and answer session at the end. So we're going to move into the piece of this webinar that focuses on our voice as faith leaders and what it means to advocate with compassion. To care for creation and to serve the most vulnerable among us are mandates shared by all major religions. It has become increasingly clear that faith-based messages and messengers provide new angles on issues and are able to lead with a neutral, nonpartisan voice of hope-filled faith. The history of social change in this country has shown over and over that the participation and influence of the religious community is profound. NCIPL's advocacy effort strategically inserts the faith community's voice and influence into climate campaigns. Lifting the faith voice to the front of the climate conversation proclaims that caring for the environment is not just political, it is a spiritual doctrine shared by all faith traditions. NCIPL's Faith in Action movement is supporting lay and ordained faith leaders to develop their individual faith voices to apply to appropriate local and state-level energy and climate issues, with goals to develop relationships with elected officials and participate in constructive and collaborative ways to influence energy policy and foster local and statewide resilience. Veronica, if you can change the slide for me, that would be great. Thank you. What does it mean to advocate with compassion? Let us take a moment to ponder the concept. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines compassion as the emotion that one feels in response to the suffering of others that motivates a desire to help. In the book, The Encyclopedia of Positive Psychology, Sherilyn Jimenez writes, quote, "Compassion is often regarded as having an emotional aspect to it, though when based on cerebral notions such as fairness, justice, and interdependence, it may be considered rational in nature and its application understood as an activity based on sound judgment. There is also an aspect of compassion which regards a quantitative dimension, such that the individual's compassion is often given a property of depth, vigor, or passion. The etymology of compassion is Latin, meaning co-suffering. More involved than simple empathy, compassion commonly gives rise to an active desire to alleviate another's suffering. This understanding of what is required from those of us that are called to advocate on behalf of our deepest values calls into a new way of being, a new way of communicating, and a new way of caring about how we are connected to the public policy process. Lawmakers are accustomed to hearing how a bill will affect business, but starting with the business model lifts up the economy as the only reason for our existence. Instead, talk first about what they love. The response from faith leaders and legislators is almost always that they love this place, North Carolina, from the mountains to the sea. They love vacations with their grandchildren from the mountains to the sea. When people of faith begin a conversation based in love, a discussion moves not to issues of business, but of humanity. What is it we're trying to experience here? What is life about? It is important for each of us to remember that the changes required to repair humanity's relationship with the natural world threaten the dominant paradigm of the industrial extractive growth society. It is through the lens of faith that hope trumps despair. By returning to the core values of our faith traditions, we can find the creativity, strength, and vision to move beyond this powerful status quo. By putting our faith into action through compassionate advocacy and values-based messages, our prayers that our leaders will respond are lifted in a new and powerful way. I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Veronica now.
Thank you, Susanna, for those moving words. I always am inspired to hear Susanna speak so eloquently about where we need to be in our hearts and minds when we're working with our elected officials. So next week, March 25th, mark your calendar, tell your friends, bring a friend. It's the first Faith Voices for Clean Energy Advocacy Day, and whether you're going to be joining us in Raleigh or virtually, we're going to run through kind of what to expect on the actual day if you're coming to Raleigh, and then we're also going to talk about getting ready for your meeting, requesting your meeting, and some tips, okay? So on Wednesday morning, this Advocacy Day will kick off at 8:30 in the morning, but that doesn't mean you have to be there at 8:30. We are not having any speakers. Some Advocacy Days, if you've been before, they'll have speakers in the morning to kick off the event, but since the evening before, Reverend Sally Bingham will be speaking at the reception at the Museum of Natural Sciences, excuse me, we are not doing an additional speaker that morning. So we hope if you're coming to Raleigh that you will join us the evening before for the reception with Sally. There's information on NCIPL's website for that. So Advocacy Day itself is really a floating day. We will have a table set up in the 1000 court of the Legislative Building, which is located on Jones Street in downtown Raleigh. It's the building directly across from the Museums of History and Science. At that table all day, we will have volunteers that can help you get to where you need to go or answer any questions. You should be scheduling your own meetings with your elected officials. We do have some folks who are involved with NCIPL leadership setting up meetings in different regions of the state, and we are happy to connect you with a group if there is a group in your area. If there's not a group in your area, I am here to help you request a meeting, coach you through whatever questions you might have on how to set it up. You can either send me a direct message in the chat box, or at the end of the presentation, we will put a slide up with my contact information, and you can contact me directly, and I can help you get your meeting scheduled. At 11:30 on Wednesday, we will all gather in the legislative cafeteria, which is in the basement of the legislative building, and have lunch together with Reverend Sally Bingham. Now, the only caveat here is if we do end up getting a meeting with one of the leadership in the General Assembly, and it's at that time, she will, of course, be attending the meeting and maybe a little late for lunch. But we will plan to gather at 11:30 to 12:30 in the legislative cafeteria. Now, committee meetings take place typically in the morning on Wednesdays. There are appropriations committee meetings and finance committee meetings that occur usually at 8:30 in the morning. And when you get to the General Assembly and you check in at the table, we'll be able to tell you what meetings are going on and where they are if you want to go sit in. We will not know what bills are being heard in the committee until the night before. So when you get there that morning, we'll be able to tell you if there's any of the bills that Greg mentioned being heard in a committee. Typically, the legislative sessions, which is when the Senate convenes as an entire body, or the House as an entire body in their chambers. They typically convene between 2 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That, again, is something that we will find out the day before what time they've scheduled the meetings, the sessions to begin. So if you're coming to Raleigh, you can plan on 8:30 to about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. If you want to go to a committee meeting in the morning, in addition to your elected official meeting, then we'll gather for lunch at 11:30, and then we'll all go and watch session together. Some folks I know will have to hit the road early to get back to where they are. That's totally fine and understandable. We just ask, you will have a feedback form that we'll give you when you check in, and we just ask that you make sure to drop that back off at the registration table. Whatever information you learn throughout your day and talking to elected officials is very important for us to know, and to also share back with our partners like Greg and Environmental Defense Fund. It can help influence strategy and make sure that everybody knows what the elected officials are talking about. NCIPL has been doing a lot of work to learn about your members of the General Assembly. We have been looking into if they are a person of faith, what their faith tradition is. We're also looking at what churches in their area are active in NCIPL. And if I have not already reached out to you, please let me know if you're interested in that information. I can also let you know what your elected official does for a living outside of being a member of the General Assembly, and help you kind of figure out a little bit more about them. We will have a leave behind for you. Typically, if you're going by yourself, one of my tips would be make sure you put all your facts and figures down on a piece of paper and spend your time telling your story and not talking about your facts. But we're going to take care of that for you next week, so you don't have to worry about that. Some of the details that Greg was just sharing will be included in that handout. And if you're going as a group, it's important to gather beforehand at the registration table, probably about 15 minutes before your meeting time, and just make sure you're on the same page about what your roles are. And I like to suggest that if you have no more than 3 to 5 people in a group, and if you have 5 people, I think that's the max for having a substantive conversation. You need one person to do the introduction, one person to make an ask, and one person to state kind of the group's overall thoughts on clean energy policies, and someone to share a very personal story or a story about the work they're doing in their congregation. And then the 5th person should be the timekeeper who thanks everyone, thanks the elected official for their time, and wraps it up. And make sure that you're showing respect and compassion for the elected official, because they have very busy schedules when they're in Raleigh, and you do not want to go over time. So the last thing we will go over, just a couple of tips. The big thing that Susanna talked about is making sure you're compassionate, and we really want to stress that. We want to make sure you're focusing on issues that are relevant into the session. So if you have questions for Greg today, please take time to ask them. And when you're talking and asking elected officials what they think, the way Susanna and I have been talking about this, the best way to start one of these meetings is after you introduce yourselves, just take a minute and say, Representative or Senator so-and-so, please tell us, what is your positive, hope-filled vision for the future of clean energy policies in North Carolina? This starts the meeting off on a positive tone. The elected officials love to talk about themselves. Let them talk first, listen, and try to find common ground. If you don't have common ground, that's fine. Definitely state your position and what you think, but be kind and respectful when you do this. And remember that this is the beginning of a relationship. This is somebody that we hope that you will continue to talk to and educate and reach out to, and someone that we hope NCIPL will be able to build a long-term relationship with, regardless of their feelings on an issue. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Susanna.
Thank you, Veronica. I'm so excited that, as she mentioned, this coming week is one of the biggest weeks that NCIPL has ever been a part of organizing. You can see on the calendars below that on March 24th, from this very office here at the Environmental Defense Fund, Reverend Sally Bingham will be launching our virtual aspect of our Spring into Action campaign, and that will happen at 3:30 p.m. It will be live streamed. It won't be very long. She'll just kick it off, and we'll have that as a recording that we can encourage and inspire people to continue throughout that time period that Veronica so eloquently explained through both the crossover deadline through the end of the legislative session. And of course, the virtual campaign should last all year long for both the long and short sessions, and then when we're out of office as well in our home districts. We'll be here to help you support getting meetings scheduled and continuing to develop those relationships year-round. Then that evening, we are having our Spring into Action celebration at the North Carolina Natural Science Museum downtown. The information is on our homepage about how you can attend that. It is free, open to the public. Bring your kids. It's great to be in the museum. And again, Reverend Sally Bingham will be delivering an address to North Carolina at 7 p.m. The event goes from 6 to 8, so we hope you can be there early on to network and meet friendly comrades and companions that are issues across the state. So please do send that information out through your network as you are willing and able. And then again on March 25th, the very next day, we will be at the General Assembly. And this is a historic moment for North Carolina because this is the first time that we have organized a standalone Faith Voices Advocacy Day. And again, we've been hearing all sorts of information about how important the energy piece is in our state moving forward. And Greg is here to directly help us with details on the bills that are going through, but also how, again, just so grateful to EDF for recognizing the unique role that the faith community can play through this process. So that brings us to where we are today. And we've been working really hard this last year to get to where we are. And before we open the lines for discussion, Veronica's, do you have anything else you'd like to share? I'm looking through the questions here. Looks like we don't have any questions that have come in. We'll give a little minute here. If anyone wants to type anything in, feel free to do so. Otherwise, we're going to put up our information at the end, so you'll have our email, our contact information. I think many of you on the phone have my direct cell phone line. That is also on the website under our leadership team information. So you're welcome to call me or text me with any questions.
And for those of you not familiar with webinars, in the bottom right corner you should see a chat box, and there should be a place for you to type a message, and you can either type it to everyone or send it directly to Susanna or I.
And I see a quick question that's just come in from Jane. And the question is, how long does a visit usually last?
So a visit usually lasts between 10 and 15 minutes during session. If you have a super friendly elected official and they want to talk a little bit more and get more detail, someone like Representative Pricey Harrison, sometimes Senator Josh Stein or Representative Graham Martin, they're all very strong on these issues that we care about, and sometimes they'll want to spend more time with you and ask more questions, and they'll want to really understand your story so that they can then relay it on to their colleagues as they do their work. But I would plan to probably have 10 to 15 minutes at the most. I would err on the shorter end, and then if you get extra time, that's great. Again, make sure you put your points down on paper ahead of time. If you think that we're not going to have it in our leave behind, you should feel free to bring your own leave behind. And you should also, at the end of the meeting, if it ends quickly, sometimes they get interrupted. Sometimes they get called for a vote really quickly, and all of a sudden your 15 minutes went to 3 minutes. And if that happens, you should just follow up in an email, thank them for their time, remember to have compassion for their day and their schedule, and put your points in that email for follow-up. And they're generally pretty good about following up.
That's great. And there are also opportunities when you do not have meetings scheduled that you can do what we call drop-by visits. And, you know, those can just, I really encourage all of us to do that around the building, to get to know the building. Veronica's going to be there particularly in the afternoon to help, you know, orientate people to the building. And you can find your local district office, or excuse me, your local office for your district and just drop by and say hi. They all have registry books, so you can drop by and they know you will be there. So I do see Bruce has asked the question. He had to miss the first hour, but could you remind us again where the registration table is going to be located in the building?
Sure. So it's in the legislative building, which is the building. Now, if you're not familiar with the government complex in downtown Raleigh, there's a legislative building, which is located on Jones Street, across from the Museums of History and Natural Sciences. And then directly behind it is what we call the LOB, the Legislative Office Building. It's a taller, multi-story building that's on what's called the mall behind the Legislative Building. We are going to be in the Legislative Building on Jones Street in the 1000 court. So when you come in the front doors of the General Assembly with the museums behind you, there's an information desk, and you can ask them to point you to the 1000 court, which are inside the building. They're square courtyards, and you'll see our table set up in the 1000 courtyard. It looks like there's another question here. What are the chances of meeting with an aide rather than the actual legislator? That's a great question, Penny. That can happen a lot, and I should explain that some legislative aides are purely administrative and have no background knowledge or understanding of the policies, and don't actually influence or inform the policy conversation. There are some elected officials that have legislative aides who are policy experts or knowledgeable on policy and can have a really in-depth conversation with you. So you need to be prepared that if you end up meeting with a legislative aide, it could just be somebody just taking notes and passing it on, or it could be somebody who is knowledgeable and wants to have a conversation with you. It's worth your time either way. I think if you can't actually get in front of the member, you should take the time. And again, you know, respect and compassion for those wonderful people down there. You know, they are not doing an easy job this time of year. Their phones ringing like crazy. The email box is exploding. People are coming in and out like a revolving door all day long. So if you get time with an aide, you should take it, and make sure you leave your leave behind. Don't leave business cards. They get lost. Make sure your contact information is on like a piece of paper with your, or the leave behind we give you, you can handwrite your contact information on that. Another question from Ann says, is the key question to ask about their vision for clean energy? That's the key opener. I think at this point, with these elected officials, they've been beaten up pretty bad. And I need to, and Susanna, you can jump in here, I need to be very honest about the backlash from the Moral Mondays movement, which has been great in many respects, but unfortunately the faith community has gotten all lumped in together, and there is some hesitancy and some skepticism from some elected officials about meeting with people in the faith community, not knowing if they're going to be attacked or recorded and it used against them later. So you may run into some tension, and you know, this approach that Susanna has really created helps to start the meeting off on a positive note and to signal to your elected official that you're not there to attack them. You're not there to be aggressive. You're not there to record the conversation and then play it back later, that you're there truly to build a relationship with them, that you truly want to understand where they're coming from. And Susanna, you can explain a little bit more about your thoughts on, everyone having a positive vision.
I think it's always really important to remember that even though these might be the most important issues to us, and where our primary values are with regards to creation care and connecting to the natural world and recognizing that the interdependent web of life is absolutely a top priority issue because it affects every single other issue under the sun, literally. But what we're looking at is the opportunity, and in all of the groups, NCIPL works in collaboration across the state on these issues with really pretty much every environmental organization out there. And even the environmental voice has been, really not had the impact necessarily that we have hoped in the state because of the resistance of folks in the General Assembly to really hear and listen and learn about these issues. And so in many cases, I've sat in committee and watched people taking votes on things that they don't actually really understand. So I think that compassionate, leadership that we can offer is to recognize that these folks are coming in and having to learn about, every bill that goes through, and if they're not personally called to, understand what the Renewable Energy Portfolio Standard does as far as a benefit, what the tax credit can do as a benefit, and that our stories are what they're going to remember. And as Veronica said, the facts are something that we can leave behind, and I want to remind you also that there are lots and lots of other groups coming in and talking fact with these leaders. What we have in the faith community are our stories. Those of us in congregations that have done energy audits to become more energy efficient are in the process of having conversations about installing solar and what the barriers are to doing that, especially with the third-party sales and how that can benefit congregations to be more be able to put our values into practice and to be able to put finances that are so critical to supporting our missions. And as we watch budget cuts happen to social services, et cetera, that's what faith communities are set up to be able to do and provide to society. And so we don't want to be spending our donation money to our congregations to pay for energy bills. We want to be able to make our communities a more healthy and thriving space for all society, and that's really the justice piece that connects us to these issues. And I think by giving the opportunity to share those stories, we really, as Greg said so beautifully, have an opportunity to change people's hearts and minds, and that's kind of the background of what we talked about with the root of what it means to advocate with compassion. So I really appreciate it. There aren't any more questions. The fact that we've come to our time, you all have given us an hour in the middle of your day, which we're incredibly grateful for. And I'd like to I'm going to turn off my webcam, but I'd like to just close us out in some words from our Earth Sabbath celebrations, which are one of the programs that we offer to congregations across the state, and have more resources and spiritual resources for all communities. So we're going to close with that, and again, I thank you so much. So this is the commissioning statement that we say at the end of each Earth celebration. Grant us a spirit of concern for the future of our environment. Bring an end to the exploitation of the Earth's scarce resources. Encourage us to be responsible stewards of your creation. Grant us a spirit of respect, recognizing the value and integrity of all creation. Encourage us to be accepting of ourselves and of others. Help us become advocates of peace, bringing an end to conflict and division. Renew our commitment to challenging the causes of injustice. Grant us a spirit of openness. to see the Spirit within and around us. Help us to rejoice in the good we have experienced as we move forward to the future. Help us to use our senses to celebrate beauty and creativity in the world. And grant us a spirit of truth to recognize failings which have hurt us, others, and the world. Give us the humility to ask for forgiveness for our part in any wrongdoing. And grant us a spirit of generosity to reach out in trust to those who we encounter. Help us to embody the divine's love in our relationships with one another and with all of creation. Thank you so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing many of you next week, and please be in touch as we move forward together in the spirit of generosity and hope for our hope-filled future. Take care.